So today we're going to go over how to build sustainable design systems like we have at Rowe Price. We've taken a web standards first approach, and I'd love to share that with you. All right, so today we're going to go over some common design system distribution patterns, Rowe Price's design system journey, our web standards first approach, challenges and considerations, and our results. So diving right in, there are three real ways that you can distribute design systems right now from a technical perspective. And when you see framework throughout this presentation, I'm talking about JavaScript frameworks. So you can use a single framework to create a design system, multi-frameworks, or you can go a framework agnostic route. The single framework pattern is one where you have company-wide adoption. Everyone's sold on a single framework. Maybe that's React, maybe it's Angular, Vue, and some of you have probably heard some of these frameworks out there. And there's really a lot of technical familiarity that you need in order to have a design system that's only focused on one framework. But this works really well for startups, small companies, and even larger companies that have a very rigid governance structure. And then there's the multi-framework pattern. And this is where you might have segmented usage. Maybe you have pockets using Angular, pockets using React, other pockets using Vue, but overall you have a good idea of where you're going, and these are the frameworks that you're going to stick with. There are companies out there that definitely focus on this approach. You've got IBM, you also have Adobe that's on it, and we've actually done it at Rowe as well. And then there's the framework agnostic approach. And I really like this one. This is where you still have segmented framework usage, but the company kind of embraces change. They don't really have a set idea of whether or not they're using React or Angular or Vue, but they're willing to change as the times change, because we know that technology is always improving, and so we can't put all of our eggs in one basket. And that leads us to the Beacon design system at Rowe Price and our first iteration. In our first iteration, in a pre-designed system landscape, we had many internal component libraries. Teams had this idea to share code, which was fantastic, but they were doing it in a way that was still siloed. You had frameworks that they were building for with these libraries. They had some with React, some with Angular. You had pockets within departments and other pockets in other departments where they were not even communicating. And the associates were looking for a way to share these things, but on a more global scale, as well as the designers. Everyone saw this need, and they also saw the need to build a design system without even saying it. They didn't know what a design system was, and this was at the point where design systems were still kind of making their way up in the industry. And when it came time to actually build one, we decided to plan for our consumers, and we have four main consumers. We have developers, of course. We have our A/B testers. We have our content authors. We use a product called Adobe Experience Manager, and we have to create those authoring experiences that are associated with the UI so that an author can go in and add content as they need to, as well as our end users. So we need to make sure that the components and all the code that we're building is performant, accessible, and delights the end user at the end of the day. So when we finally kicked off, we internally open sourced the build-out. And by that, I mean that we started getting developers from across the different organizations, finally talking with each other, getting in one room, and started contributing the components from each of their libraries into a centralized place. We then centralized those components around design tokens for theming. So that way, when our designers provided the designs for each of these components, we had a way to style them without structuring the components in a way that they couldn't be changed later. And design tokens is, of course, a really hot topic in the design space, but it's something that we also have on the tech side, and I'll get into in a little bit. And we also formed a team to manage and improve this system. We started with just a single developer, but have quickly grown, and we're now up to 7. But while this worked well for a certain period of time, we had some lessons learned. We realized that maintaining the technical standards was really challenging. We knew that there was also really hard complications around feature parity, because you build something in React and then you try to build it in Angular. Maybe the features weren't there in Angular that were in React, or vice versa. And so then you had to make sure that you're keeping up with the developer experience that the consumers were expecting. If they were expecting to be able to use certain features of React, we should make sure that those are available for them to use. And then the maintaining of strong developer experience feeds really right into that. If we can't focus on a single framework, or if we are spreading ourselves too thin, then we can't focus on those that are actually using the components on their day-to-day work. And then finally, managing library versions became super challenging because we'd have to make sure that the version of React that we had in our repo still covered all of the features that people were using from legacy versions of React. Same with Angular and the other frameworks that we supported. So this brought us to the point where we needed to have a crucial pivot. We needed to make some change based on all of these learnings, and that change led us to our web standards first architecture. And this is one that I'm really proud of, that we've really worked hard on. And here we offer native web components that are functionally supported by the web specifications and themed with design tokens. So we kept those design tokens around, but we changed the vehicle by which we send the design system out to our consumers. Now you might be wondering, what are web components? Well, they're made up of 4 different technologies. I won't dive too deep. But they're custom elements, HTML, Shadow DOM, NES modules. Now, I mention those because I'm going to be referring to a couple of these throughout the deck. But these provide native browser support. So when you're building a component, you build it once, and you can drag and drop it on the page without any additional build steps, because the browser actually knows how to interpret that component after it's already been built. So you don't need to have a complicated build step right before it goes out to a live page. And then there's framework compatibility. Since the browser supports these features, the frameworks that are built around them automatically support them as well. So we can build a web component, and it can be used by an Angular developer because Angular supports the web standards, and the web component follows web standards. We get style encapsulation, and that comes with the Shadow DOM, and a clear and familiar API that developers can use, because the components, the way that they're structured and the way that they're intended to be used, are very, very similar to HTML elements. So if you've used HTML or CSS, then you should be able to use these web components. Now, the exciting thing for all the designers in the room is if you know a little bit about HTML and CSS and your company is using web components, you could actually build some of these experiences without having to have a lot of developer workflow, and you can do it on your own. So I think that's pretty exciting. Next, we have the supporting technologies. Behind all of our web components, we follow the web specs pretty rigidly. We use HTML spec features like the different semantic HTML elements, dialog, input, and button. Each of those elements actually provide features that we don't have to build on our own, and they provide accessibility features. So we don't have to include those as well. So why not use them over using divs, spans, other things that don't make sense in the context of an HTML structure? Next, we have CSS specification features. Here we're using CSS Grid. Now, we could have chose to use something like Tailwind, or if you recall a few years ago where it was its popularity, Bootstrap. There was also Foundation. A lot of those provided style frameworks so you can create your own grid. Well, the web learned along the way, behind the scenes, and they came out with CSS Grid, and that's what we're using now to structure the look and feel of our components. We're also using CSS variables to theme our components dynamically, and Flexbox to adjust our layout. Then when we get into JavaScript, of course, there's plenty of JavaScript for us to use in there, but I want to call out a few examples. We have intersection observer and mutation observer, both of which we use within our components to understand the interactivity around the component, how that end user works with it. And so instead of building our own, using a third-party library, we come here first. Now, this isn't to say that we never use libraries. We're actually using a library called lit as the boilerplate for our web components. But we do focus on this and make sure that we prioritize this first over those abstractions. And then finally, design token spec features. Design tokens are just a way for us to structurally understand designs and apply those designs to our components without baking them into the components themselves. And this allows us to switch the color dynamically on the web page. And so that way, when you click if you have a dark and light mode button, you want to click that, everything changes all at once. I'll show a little bit of an example at the end if you're not familiar, but that's kind of the overview. And with all of these features, we have a new workflow. That workflow consists of an investigation stage, architecture, build, and integration test. In our investigation stage, We do a lot of scouring of the web, feel out what people are building, how other design systems have taken care of the similar problems. We also really focus on the W3C. So we go there, they've got a whole revamped site, plug for W3C, but you can search in there, find all the different features here. I was just looking up Grid, you can see it coming up there, and then you can just see what's possible. Next, we spend a lot of time with our architecture. So we get the designs from our designers on the tech side of our design system. And from those designs, we come up with a complete architecture that caters to our users. So we come up with our content model, how those authors are going to interact with the components that we build. We also come up with the API. So how will the developers interact with the component? We even go as far as to write a sample HTML structure for our component to make sure that we're following the semantic HTML standard. And that way, it doesn't come out with just divs at the end. And there are a lot of other things that we put in there, and if we have any third-party libraries that we are using, we do make sure to mention them at the bottom. Now, it is important to note that this isn't just within our team that we're doing this, and we're just focusing on making sure that we're getting the product through. We're also sharing this with the community and the designers, so that way they have a better idea of how the component works, and they can provide feedback as well. Next, we have build. So this step is pretty straightforward. We build the component based on the architecture, but we recognize that changes may come. So if the architecture needs to be changed, we make sure to update that after we build, and then we deploy it. But all of those docs are considered assets of our design system. We put them out there. We put them in our, we're currently using Storybook. We put them in our Storybook and our documentation tool, and then we make them available. And then finally, we have the integration testing stage. Now, this stage is not critical for us, because we know web components can be used across frameworks. But what we do want to know is, what's the developer experience like? Is it really strong, or is it something that kind of just passes? So we go into a basic React app, an Angular app, AEM, Adobe Experience Manager, and just straight HTML, and use the components, eat our own dog food, if you will, and then just test them out to make sure that they're working as expected. All right, let's dive into some examples. So the first one is the modal example. For the modal example, we're going to go over two main topics, CSS Grid for layout, and then also the semantic HTML. So for this modal, we are using the dialog HTML element. Now this HTML element automatically comes with features to open and close. It comes with baked-in accessibility, and the ability to transfer data back to the window. Again, we could have used a third-party library for this, but the web supports it, so we use the dialog element. But next we have CSS Grid. Now I've already mentioned kind of like the basics of that and what it provides, but an important thing to note is that it also provides item placement and ordering. And this is a key feature of how we make this modal more flexible than your average modal. We know that we have some strict guidelines around how developers and designers should work within the design system and how we want it to look. But we also want to spark innovation. We want teams to still try new things. So we don't want to make our components too rigid that they can't do that. So with this item placement, we can see that we have the media zone up top, the title comes next, and the content comes below. Using CSS Grid, we can dynamically change the ordering of this, and you can see here if the developer passes in a new order of title, media, and then content, it switches the look and feel of the component, so that way it can work in those cases where our initial implementation may not have. Next, we get into form fields. So for form fields, we're going to go over the element internals API briefly, and then also the CSS variable usage that we have within our forms. So the element internals API enables our components to work with native HTML elements. And by that I mean that if we take a look at this example here, we can see that we have input fields, a drop-down, we've got some error messages, some radio buttons, and they're all wrapped within what is called it's just a native form element. Well, if we were to build our own form component, all of our developer consumers would have to bring that in. They'd have to make sure that it worked with their current system, and we know that many teams already have their own structure for how they want to build forms, and then make sure that it works without fail. With this approach, and using the element internals web API, we're able to connect with the native form element, which means that we can already, the elements and the components that we have here can be used within any form that already exists. And we're in a state where T-Rowe has been around for quite a long while, so we have a lot of legacy systems. This is really important for us, to make sure that it works with those legacy systems. And next we have theming. So we use CSS variables throughout all of our components. That's how we drive the theme. So everything from the text to the border to the color of the background, it's all driven that way. But that leads to flexibility in the way that that theme can work. So if you have a company that maybe has brought in a new company, maybe there was a merger, now you can use the same components, theme them a little bit differently using overrides, and then they'll still work just as expected. The functionality is baked in, but the theme is dynamic. And so what our plan is that we're using design tokens to generate these CSS variables, and we plan to connect those design tokens with our design products, and we're hoping that Figma comes out with their design token solution, but there are many other opportunities out there for us to connect with our design partners. And you can see there the different change in theme. But it's not all roses, of course. There's challenges and considerations that we need to think about. The first one is React support. So if you don't use React, slide's not for you. But if you do use React, I do want to mention that they do support web components. But web components, they don't support some of the developer ergonomic features that a lot of the other frameworks do. Fortunately, the React team has been working on changes for this. And I've heard that in their next release, they're going to be including these changes, which is really exciting for us. However, we also know that teams can't just switch the second the new React version comes out. That's going to take time. Especially at a large company, you may not have the resources to do that right away. So Lit, which I mentioned before, was the boilerplate code that we use. That library that's built by Google, they've also created a wrapper generator for React. So we now have a React wrapper around our web components, and that's built within our pipeline steps. So we don't have to do any type of manual work or do any additional development. Our React consumers can just pull from that part of our repo, and it works the same exact way as if you were using a web component. But you get those developer ergonomic features that you wouldn't normally have. Next, we have server-side rendering. So server-side rendering is supported with web components now. These are some new features that came out recently, but there are some changes that you need to think about when building those web components as well as in your application. And finally, we have resistance to change. With any large change, especially for something as large as a design system, you need to make sure you're making the right call. In order to do that and to convince others, it's best to reach out to folks. So during that time period, when we initially were building out with Angular, React, and AEM, we saw that it wasn't working. We decided to look to the industry, figure out what others were doing. We reached out to folks from Adobe, from Shoelace, which Corey LaVisca, he's running that project. It was just brought in by another company. Fantastic work there, and they were able to give us a lot of insight. And so I encourage you, if you have any questions, I'm happy to meet with any of you after the talk, but yeah, get some feedback from the industry and then bring it back to your teams. That's how we got everybody on board. And now for the results and feedback. So since we made this pivot, it's been about 9 months. During that time, we have made 36 components, and 12 web applications are using the design system. And I can say, actually, this morning I was looking at my email, and I saw that another consumer was actually added. So we're jumping up to 13 there. And then of those existing 12, there were 4 application technologies used. I want to make sure to note those. So we've some of them were using Angular, others were using React, others were using AEM. But I think the most interesting one was a project that was a more legacy project that we're using JSPs still. This technology worked with those JSPs without a ton of additional work. They didn't have to include a whole framework to get it to work for them. They were just able to use the assets that we provided them, which is really exciting for us. And if those numbers aren't enough, I wanted to go over a few pieces of feedback. The first one is about one source of truth. This was a React and AEM application developer, and they said, centralizing around web technologies reduces the need to learn new component APIs when switching between applications. if you're doing all this context switching anyway, why do we need to introduce a whole nother layer of context switching, which is to understand a brand new API when they're going back and forth? This enabled them to work a lot faster, and it's a lot cleaner for them because they know where to fix the bugs. The next one, and I'm really excited about this one, is prototyping. This was by an A/B tester. And so they said that web components make prototyping and A/B testing more efficient as they can be directly imported into web pages without requiring build tools. And so by this, what their process looked like before was that they had to work with the technology, that whatever team was building their application in, to make sure that the component would work on their web page. Well, now since the browser supports the components that are being used, they can drag and drop it right in, and it just works. And so if we create a button, they want to theme it differently, they can drag and drop that button on the page, they can style it, and they can check to see how well that works with the consumer. Next, we have shareable patterns. They said Beacon, the design system, provides technical patterns that can be used in any framework, and this allows us to easily use and apply them in our own application. So now we're seeing that these standards that we're using here and the process that we're putting in place can also now be used across other applications, and we're seeing it in use, and it's working well. So there are some components out there that don't necessarily make it into the design system. Maybe they're more composite components. Maybe they're making calls to a service, but they still should be shared across different parts of the org. Well, that's where these types of patterns come into play, and this individual was saying that had really helped them out. And then finally, theming. One of the things I've been mentioning pretty consistently throughout this talk. Design tokens enable our team to efficiently and reliably adapt existing experiences to a shared design framework. And this was an AEM developer working on somewhat legacy application. They had components that were built several years ago, pre-design system. And they found that by having these design tokens and the CSS variables that were generated allowed them to better style their existing componentry while they were onboarding to the new design system with our components there. All right, some key learnings to mention. With this pattern, we now have a modular approach, one that doesn't require build steps after publishing. It's also interoperable, meaning that you can choose a framework, bring it to the table at the application level, and you can use the components in there as well. But most importantly, it's sustainable. We can build for today without negatively impacting the future. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Alex. I think in this current climate, we're all looking for ways to become more efficient and more effective. And I think design systems are a really great way for teams to really push forward their development and enable teams to move faster.
Yeah.
So questions for Alex. Is there anything up online?
Yes.
Awesome.
We have a few questions from the live audience. The first question is from Rushan Myers. Is there a plan to consolidate the various JS frameworks into streamlined approach?
So I think that's an organizational challenge, right? And that also takes time. But it is something that we at Tiro are looking to move towards, but we also want to encourage new ways of working, and we don't want to restrict ourselves necessarily to a single framework. I do want to mention that this is a talk not to bash frameworks in general. There are places for all of these technologies, but the best thing to mention is that the use case that we're using these for, it makes sense for a design system. So if teams want to use Vue and there's an actual use case, like there's a case for that, then I would encourage them to do it. But we should probably have some more standards around the frameworks within our organization. And I would encourage others to have that as well, even if it's narrowing it down to a subset from what they have today.
Awesome.
All right, thank you. Adam Carignan asks, how do you handle the tab index and CSS order?
How do you handle the tab index and CSS order? Well, it depends on the component, depends on the feature. We oftentimes are looking for existing ways to handle that. Sometimes it's with JavaScript. We try to use mostly HTML and CSS, but if we have to put also like maybe some attributes on the HTML elements themselves to make them more accessible, we'll do that to increase the tabbing capability within the component. So one example would be like the modal. How do you focus trap within that? So we had to add additional functionality to do that with JavaScript.
All right, and the last question from the live audience: how do you align with designers on variable naming conventions?
That's so tough. Naming is so hard. We're doing that now. And that's, so it originally started, just clicked. Okay. We originally started with the technical approach. And that was because design tokens, to my knowledge, came out more on the tech side than it did the design side. And so now that there's like a lot more investment in design tokens on the design side, we're looking for ways to kind of sync those up. And the only way to do that is really to make sure that our naming convention is down. So we're looking at trying to make sure that we're providing a bit of context within that CSS variable or the design token naming, but not too much where you would have to memorize 1,000 different tokens. It is a super hard topic, and I think we're going to see a lot of articles and new ways of working in that space.
Awesome. Anybody in the crowd? All right, right there. I'm going to pass this back to you.
Best of luck.
Right.
What teamwork?
I know, I love to see it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so obviously, as we know, design systems take a lot of investment from both design and development. So what was your process for getting your leadership stakeholders to invest in your design system and put the time and energy it needed to be as successful as it is now?
Yeah, this is an excellent question. I've got an answer for you. So without taking too long with it, the high level is that we started actually with a grassroots approach to our design system. We saw the need, we saw the trends on both design and dev side, and we drove it from there. We actually created the initial version with all of the other developers and designers in just through meetings, like weekly meetings. We were creating new things and making sure that it would work for the developers that we were creating them for. And then over time, people started using these things, and we were able to show value. And with that value, we were able to go to the management and say, hey, there's this value. We have about 8 teams already using this. So should we now fund it? And we eventually got quite a bit of funding because we were able to show that value, and that spoke louder than, hey, we want to just reuse this thing, and we also want to make sure there's consistency. Having those numbers really helped us. So that was our route. But it really differs between companies, because if you have management that already knows about this type of system and they're already on board with it, then you have to do a lot less legwork. But now we have the entire organization from bottom to top all invested in this, and we have objectives set aside to make sure that people and teams are using these tools and that we're using them properly. So that's kind of a bit about how we went about it, but we'd be happy to talk with you afterward if you're more interested.
Love to. Thank you.
Detail. Yeah.
I'm right up here in the front. Can you? Thank you so much.
I do love this thing.
I know, it's great. You can toss it, but you might hit someone, so.
So the numbers that you shared of like how many components you'd created, the adoption after your pivot, what size team, both on development and UI design, were you working with to get those numbers?
Yeah, so we now have a team of approximately 7 developers, 6 full-time, and several designers that are in London. So we have the developers in the US, designers based in London, and that's kind of what we've had for the past, I want to say, year or so, a year and a half.
All design system dedicated, or
all design system dedicated. It took a good bit to get there, but we were able to negotiate kind of how we wanted to fund it and what kind of resources we wanted to build this up. And then it wasn't all at once, by the way. This wasn't like, hey, here's 6 devs. It was, we started off with an entry-level engineer to join the team. He's still with the team, excellent dev, and we actually grew it out that way. So we had more folks come in from our entry-level program. We got them trained up on front-end best practices, and they're now building out this system. So we're able to kind of fund it with that approach.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, sure thing.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Please give another round of applause.